Welcome to TOCHI Stories. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on post notification because it will mean the whole world to me. Now let's get right into the story. Brace yourself. The sun had barely risen when Amaka stepped out of her family's cramped one-room apartment, the weight of the morning already sinking into her bones. Her mother was coughing again, a hoarse, dry sound that scraped against the silence. Her younger brother, Ikenna, had run out of medicine 3 days ago, and the fever had returned last night with vengeance. The landlord had threatened eviction if they didn't pay the 2-month rent arrears by sunset. Still, Amaka gritted her teeth and tied her worn scarf around her head. She had deliveries to make, and somewhere along the way, she hoped she'd find a miracle, or at least a customer who wouldn't haggle her already low prices. As she stepped into the back alley that cut through her neighborhood, the stench of garbage slapped her in the face. Lagos mornings were not kind to the poor. But it was there, just beside the green, overflowing waste bin, that she saw him, a heap of filth that at first glance looked like a bundle of rags. But as she stepped closer, the rags stirred. The old man lay crumpled in the mud, his gray beard caked with dirt, lips cracked and dry, eyes sunken and distant like someone who had forgotten what it meant to be human. His fingernails were thick with grime, his clothes stiff and reeking. Amaka recoiled instinctively, but then she paused. Something about the man reminded her of someone, maybe her late grandfather, maybe someone she'd seen in church when she was a child. His body was trembling. Passers-by walked around him without sparing a glance. Some even spit in disgust. One boy threw a sachet of water at him, laughing when the man flinched. Amaka's heart clenched. She knew that feeling too well, the ache of being invisible. She looked at the old bread in her bag meant for her mother's morning meal. It wasn't much, just a small loaf and a sachet of pure water. But without thinking twice, she crouched beside him and gently placed it near his chest. The man didn't speak. He just stared at her like no one had looked at him in years. "You can eat it," Amaka said softly, brushing a fly away from his cheek. The man blinked, then moved his hand slowly toward the bread. She stayed with him a little longer, watching as he nibbled like a starving child. A sharp pain twisted in her stomach. Hunger and pity tangled. She had nothing left for her family now, but this felt right. As she stood to leave, the man whispered something she couldn't quite catch. She turned. "What did you say?" His lips moved again, slower this time. "Thank you," he rasped, voice barely audible. The sound caught her off guard. In a world where curses came easily and gratitude felt extinct, this frail stranger's words burned into her chest. Amaka didn't know then that this man was once one of Nigeria's most feared tycoons. She didn't know his story, but something inside her, call it instinct or madness, told her he was more than what he appeared. And despite everything she lacked, she couldn't walk away. Back home, the air was heavy with dread. Amaka's mother sat on the floor, her back resting weakly against the wall, counting coins over and over again as if repetition would multiply them. Her wrapper was faded, and her eyes held that familiar cloud of worry. "Amaka," she said sharply the moment her daughter walked in. "Where is the bread?" Amaka hesitated. I gave it to someone who needed it more." Her mother's face twisted in disbelief and fatigue. "We have nothing, Amaka. Your brother is burning with fever. I have not eaten. You had one job, bring food, and you gave it to a stranger." Amaka sat beside her, eyes brimming with silent guilt. She had no answers, only a pain in her stomach, and a flicker of hope that kindness still mattered. Her mother wasn't wicked, just tired. Life had been cruel to them both. 2 years ago, their father died in a motor accident on his way to deliver fabric. Since then, the sewing machine had been Amaka's inheritance, and the burden of survival had become her reality. By noon, the eviction notice was slapped on their rusted door. The landlord didn't knock. He never did. Amaka tried to plead with him again, but he was unmoved. "If I don't get my money by 6 p.m., you all are sleeping outside," he barked. "No sentiment, I've tried." The neighbors pretended not to hear. In a place where poverty was the common currency, everyone feared being the next victim. Ikenna moaned from the mattress, his forehead hot to the touch. The hospital had already turned them away due to unpaid bills. Amaka sat with his head in her lap and wept silently. Still, she thought of the man. Had he eaten the bread fully? Was he still lying there by the bin? Something about his eyes had haunted her. They weren't the eyes of a madman. They were the eyes of someone who had once mattered, eyes that had seen too much and lost everything. She didn't understand it, but a part of her ached for him more than she could explain. As night fell and her mother cried softly in a corner, Amaka made up her mind. With just 500 Nigerian nairas tucked under the seam of her skirt, the last money from her last customer, she slipped out again. She boiled water in a small plastic flask, stole an old towel, and headed back to the dustbin. The old man was still there, huddled and shivering. "You came back," he said, barely able to raise his head. She knelt, cleaned his hands, fed him warm gari and groundnuts she bought with her last naira, and wrapped him in the towel. "Why are you doing this?" he asked faintly. Amaka smiled, brushing dust from his brow. "Because no one helped my father when he was dying by the roadside. Maybe this is how I forgive the world." She didn't know his name. She didn't know what he carried. But that night, while the world slept and her family's problems threatened to swallow her whole, Amaka sat by a stranger and gave him the only thing she had left, her humanity. Before he became the man in the gutter, Chief Dominic was a force. In his prime, he wore crisp agbatas lined with gold thread, and his voice could silence a boardroom. His name alone was enough to close business deals. He didn't rise through inheritance. He built his empire with iron fists, sleepless nights, and calculated ruthlessness. From oil to cement, from real estate to logistics, he expanded his reach while sacrificing everything else. The mansion in Ikoyi stood like a monument to his success: marble floors, imported chandeliers, glass walls. But within those walls, his wife Adora had become a ghost. Once vibrant and full of song, she now moved through the house like a shadow, barely noticed. Dominic didn't mean to neglect her. In his mind, every late night, every ignored conversation, every canceled anniversary was for the family. But intentions meant little to a heart starving for love. Adora tried to speak up, softly at first, then with desperation. "Dominic," she'd say, standing in the doorway of his study at 1 a.m., "I miss you." He would nod absent-mindedly, never looking up from the papers. "Let me finish this contract, Ada. We'll talk later." But later never came. Weeks turned into months. When she tried to touch him in bed, he would turn away, groaning about stress. Her beauty faded not with age, but with sorrow. In the mirror, she no longer saw herself, only a woman trapped in a palace. She wrote him letters, placed them on his pillow. They went unread. She sat beside him at breakfast in silence, hoping he'd see the tears hiding behind her smile. But he never did. She was alive, but he was already mourning her, not because she had died, but because he no longer felt her presence. The servants noticed. The house became colder, quieter. Even their only son, Obinna, began to withdraw. The boy was 8 when he first asked his mother, "Why doesn't Daddy smile at you?" Adora didn't answer. How could she? Love that isn't fed becomes starvation, and hers had long since reached famine. Dominic still saw her physically, but emotionally, she was air, present, but invisible. She waited, hoping that one day he would stop long enough to look at her the way he once did when they were poor and struggling. But that day never came. And so Adora began to die, not suddenly, not loudly, but slowly, painfully from the inside. And Dominic, blinded by spreadsheets and ambitions, never noticed the lights going out one by one in the mansion he built with blood. Obinna had every toy a child could dream of, but none of the attention he craved. At age 5, he learned to read not because someone sat with him, but because the housekeeper left newspapers lying around. His birthday parties were planned by assistants, his questions answered by tutors. Dominic's presence was like a ghost that walked past him in well-ironed clothes. The boy once drew a picture of his family, just him and his mother. When asked why his father wasn't in it, he answered plainly, "Because I don't know what his eyes look like." The mansion was filled with imported laughter from cartoons and televisions. but none from a father tossing his child in the air or kneeling to wipe a scraped knee. The only person who ever saw him was his mother, and even she was fading, like soft perfume in a large room. As Obinna grew older, the hunger for attention turned into resentment. He began breaking things on purpose, throwing tantrums not because he was spoiled, but because he just wanted to be seen. In school, Obinna started fighting other children. When teachers complained, Dominic didn't show up at the meetings. His personal assistant did. When he got suspended at age 10, Dominic's only reaction was a deduction in his allowance. Obinna learned that causing trouble brought faster reactions than obedience ever did. He started swearing, hiding alcohol, cursing at maids. His mother would cry softly, trying to discipline him with love, but her voice was no match for the thunder of Dominic's indifference. Once, in a desperate bid for his father's approval, Obinna scored the highest in class and waited by the staircase all day for Dominic to return from work. When he finally walked through the doors, Obinna ran up with the result sheet. "I came first, Daddy," he shouted, eyes gleaming. Dominic didn't stop walking. "That's expected," he said flatly. "Let me rest." And that was the last time Obinna tried to impress him. By the time he turned 17, Obinna had transformed into the very thing he once resented: cold, dismissive, emotionally barren. He started partying with older friends, spending recklessly, using his last name like a master key. He knew the bodyguards would clean up his messes. He flirted with women like they were products, slept with models twice his age, and dismissed anyone who asked about his father. "I don't have one," he'd say casually, sipping whiskey at beach clubs. Deep down, though, the wound still bled. A boy who had been starving for affection now turned gluttonous for distraction. The mansion became a battlefield of silences. His mother, weakened by years of neglect, watched her son spiral and still tried to hold him close. But even she could no longer reach him fully. The emotional heritage of Dominic's coldness had taken root. What started as a boy longing to be seen had become a man determined never to feel again. Adora had once been the envy of her peers. Her wedding to Dominic had made headlines in the society pages. She was known as Madame Soft Smile, always elegant, always reserved, always gracious. But no one saw the sadness growing behind her poise. In the first few years of marriage, before the wealth exploded, they had something special. Dominic would call her NNEM, run his fingers through her braids, and whisper that she was his piece. But that Dominic faded slowly, like color from a photograph left in the sun. Once the business began to grow, it consumed him like wildfire. Dinners became brief check-ins. Hugs became pats on the back. And kisses? Forgotten rituals. Adora tried to adapt. She joined women's groups, through charity events, even tried gardening to fill her days. But nothing filled the void of being married to a man who saw her only as a domestic function, not a woman to be loved, but a role to be maintained. Intimacy died quietly. Nights turned cold. Dominic began sleeping in his study or returning late enough that conversations became awkward rituals. Adora bought new nightgowns, left the lights dimmed, even tried soft perfumes, but nothing worked. He'd kiss her forehead, mumble goodnight, and drift off. There were no affairs. No scandas. Just distance. The worst kind, the kind that wears matching clothes and shares meals, but feels like strangers across the table. She stopped complaining, because each time she tried, he called her ungrateful. "Do you know how many women would kill to live your life?" he once snapped when she cried. That night, she slept on the floor, hugging a pillow. The mansion had more rooms than memories. Her laughter became less frequent. Her eyes, once lively, now looked permanently tired. The maids began whispering, wondering why Madame always looked so lost in a house filled with everything money could buy. She began to write again. Small journal entries, letters she never intended to send. They all began with "Dear Dominic." In them, she confessed her sadness, her loneliness, her fears that Obinna was turning into a colder version of his father. She wrote about how she missed the boy who used to dance with her barefoot in the compound under the rain. She prayed too, not for wealth, but for attention. Just one night where he would sit beside her and ask, "How are you really?" but the prayers fell into a ceiling too high to echo. One day, after yet another dinner alone, Adora sat in her bathtub, wearing a headscarf and clutching a Bible. She looked at her reflection and whispered, "This isn't what I married for." It was the first time she said it out loud, and the beginning of the end. The morning Adora died began like any other. She served Obina breakfast he barely touched, scolded the maid gently for oversalting the soup, and called Dominic twice to check if he'd be back for dinner. Of course he wasn't. He was at a board meeting discussing a merger worth billions. Adora felt a dull ache in her chest that afternoon. Not sharp, just persistent. She ignored it. After all, she was only 48. She folded laundry, wrote a note for the driver, and took her medicine. By evening, her hands began to tremble. She staggered to her room and sat on the edge of her bed. The mirror across from her showed a woman who looked far older than her years. Her fingers clutched her robe tightly. Then, slowly, she fell back. By the time a maid found her, her eyes were barely open. She was murmuring something, not in pain, but in prayer. Tell him I waited." Dominic rushed back when he got the call. For the first time in a decade, he broke traffic laws himself. When he arrived at the hospital, she was on oxygen. Obina stood in the hallway, stiff and confused. Dominic barged in and held her hand. "Ada, I'm here now. I'm here." Her lips moved. Her eyes searched his face like she was trying to memorize him one last time. "Why did you only see me when I'm leaving?" she whispered. Her fingers twitched in his palm. A monitor beeped once, then flatlined. Dominic screamed her name, shaking her shoulders. "No, no, no. Adora." But the woman who had been waiting for a husband's affection for years had already gone. Her heart, neglected and burdened, had finally surrendered. The nurses pulled Dominic away as he collapsed to the ground, his hands trembling. "She's gone, sir. I'm sorry." The funeral was lavish. Politicians, celebrities, business partners. The tabloids praised her grace and motherhood. Dominic stood at the graveside, expression hollow. Obina stood beside him, face hard as stone. He didn't cry. He didn't move. But as the first shovelful of sand hit the coffin, he turned to his father and said coldly, "You killed her." Dominic blinked. "What?" "She begged you to see her. All she ever wanted was your time, your love. But your business was always more important. I hate you for that." Dominic didn't reply. He couldn't. Because, for the first time in his life, he couldn't hide behind logic or spreadsheets. He had lost the one woman who loved him despite himself. And now he had lost a son too. That night, he sat in Adora's wardrobe, wrapped in one of her scarves, sobbing into her perfume-stained pillow. The empire meant nothing now. Power meant nothing. And for the first time since his rise, Chief Dominic Ease was truly alone. The mansion that once stood as a symbol of Dominic's dominance now echoed with the footsteps of a broken man. Adora's absence was more deafening than her presence ever was. The staff treaded lightly, unsure whether to speak or vanish entirely. Every room reminded Dominic of her. The pink mug in the kitchen, the humming she used to do while folding his shirts, the pair of church shoes she always kept by the door in case he ever agreed to accompany her on a Sunday. He couldn't sleep in their bedroom anymore. The smell of her body lotion on the sheets made his heart shatter anew every night. Instead, he moved into his study, curling on the couch like a child seeking refuge from nightmares. But there was no escape, not from grief, and certainly not from guilt. He was tormented by the realization that Adora had spent her last years watching him from the sidelines, loving him with everything, receiving nothing in return. Each morning, Dominic dressed in full suits out of habit, but had nowhere to go. His meetings were canceled indefinitely. His business partners assumed he needed time to grieve, but they didn't know he had unraveled completely. He'd sit in the dining room, pour her favorite Zobo into a glass, and whisper apologies to the chair she once occupied. Her pictures, once just decorations in gold frames, became accusations. He began talking to them. Long conversations, confessing things he never said aloud when she was alive. "I didn't know how to love you, Ada," he wept one evening. cradling a frame like a relic. I thought provision was love. I didn't know silence could kill someone's spirit. Obinna avoided the house as much as possible. When he did come, it was only to retrieve personal belongings. He refused eye contact with his father. "You were more of a CEO than a husband," he spat once. "Now you can run your company alone. I'm done." The pain became too loud to bear. One morning, Dominic packed a small bag, took the last photo they had taken together, the one where Adora was smiling faintly while holding his arm, and walked out without telling anyone. He left behind the titles, the staff, the cars. He transferred full ownership of the company and the estate to Obinna through his lawyer. The old man took nothing but a coat, a hat, and his guilt. At first, people assumed he had traveled for peace of mind. Days passed, then weeks. Eventually, his face appeared on a small blog, spotted wandering near the outskirts of town, looking disoriented. The headline read, "Is this the once powerful Chief Ease?" But nobody cared long enough to confirm. The powerful man had vanished, and no one went looking. No one, except for the son, who claimed to hate him, but couldn't stop dreaming of the last time he heard his mother's voice break from sadness. Obinna had grown into his father's shadow, without realizing it. After Adora's death and Dominic's sudden disappearance, he threw himself into work, not out of ambition, but out of deflection. He bought clubs, expanded the real estate business, and dated women like they were part of an unsatisfying routine. None of them lasted. He had mastered the art of being emotionally unavailable. When journalists praised his business acumen, he nodded, but felt nothing. Each time a woman told him she loved him, he tightened inside. "Don't love me," he once told a girlfriend who had made him dinner. "Just enjoy the ride." The woman had left crying. Obinna never apologized. He had inherited wealth and power, but also the emptiness that came with growing up unseen. His father's abandonment had cracked something deeper than he admitted. He missed the man, but couldn't say it. He hated him, yet searched every crowd for a glimpse of his aging frame. The contradiction tormented him. Years passed. The world forgot Dominic Ease. His pictures vanished from newspapers, his name from headlines. Obinna pretended not to care. But on the inside, he battled a storm. Grief for his mother, anger toward his father, and confusion about who he was becoming. One day, while at his estate, a former security guard who had retired early came to visit. He brought a plastic bag containing a newspaper. "I don't know if this is real, sir," the man said hesitantly, "but I saw this article." The face looked familiar. Obinna snatched the paper and froze. There, in grainy black and white, was a picture of a dirty man near a waste dump, thin, bearded, hollow-eyed. The article called him a madman, but Obinna knew. He knew immediately. "It's him," he whispered. "It's my father." He felt his knees wobble. The man who once commanded cities now looked like a beggar forgotten by time. Obinna didn't sleep that night. For the first time in years, he cried. Not for his wealth, not for his position, but for the little boy who had once waited by the gate with his school result. He remembered that evening too clearly, how his father didn't even look up. "He never got a second chance with Mum," Obinna murmured in the dark, "but maybe I can give him one now." He began pulling strings. He sent drivers, investigators, even health workers to track him down. But the trail was cold. No one knew where the man had gone. Months passed with no update. Obinna grew frustrated. He started to believe he was too late. But then, one evening, his assistant walked in and said, "Sir, you may want to see this. We just received word from someone in Ajagunal. An old man's being cared for by a young girl. Her name is Amaka, and she doesn't even know who he is." Amaka's hands were calloused. Her back ached from hours of sewing, and her heart carried more worry than most women her age should bear. Yet, despite the mountain of struggles she climbed daily, she was still the first to offer food to a crying child and the last to judge a stranger. Her family's condition had worsened since she fed the old man. The landlord had given them a final notice. Her younger brother was still ill, and the hospital refused treatment without deposit. Yet each night, she boiled water and wiped the old man's face with gentle patience. She called him Baba, even though he didn't say much about himself. He smiled at her like he was grateful just to be seen. When she sewed clothes, he sat nearby, humming softly, as if her presence brought him peace. Her mother grumbled, but said nothing anymore. She too, in secret, had begun to respect the old man, not because of anything he had, but because of the way he watched over Amaka like a guardian angel in rags. The neighbors laughed at her. "So you've added street madmen to your charity list," one woman sneered. "You don't even have enough for your family, yet you're feeding a ghost." Amaka ignored them. "One day," she said calmly, "we'll all wish we had someone to treat us like humans when we're nothing." She sold her best wrapper to buy the man's medicine when he began coughing blood. He didn't ask. She just noticed and acted. She stitched a hole in his trouser, made him new sandals from discarded soles, and even taught him how to say grace before eating. Slowly, his mind returned. He began to speak clearly. He'd watch the sky and say things like, "My wife used to love evenings like this," or "I had a son once." Strong-willed. Proud. Like me, sadly. Amaka never pressed him for details. If he wanted to remember, he would. If not, she'd just be there, a silent witness to his healing. What she didn't know was that her small acts of compassion had sent ripples beyond her compound. One of Obina's investigators had come to verify the claim about a girl in Ajagunal. He had taken pictures and sent them back. Obina stared at the image for hours. Amaka crouched by a small plastic stove, cooking pap while the old man sat on a stool wrapped in a faded blanket. She looked nothing like the women he dated. No makeup, no designer hair, no filters, just raw kindness, real humanity. Something about her stirred something buried deep inside him, the memory of his mother's eyes. "That's the girl," Obina said quietly. "That's the one my father chose." And at that moment, he didn't feel like a billionaire. He felt like a son, and he knew he had to meet her. Obina had never visited a slum before, not in person. He had driven past Ajagunal countless times, always with tinted windows and police escorts. To him, it had always been a blur of rusted roofs, overloaded tricycles, and children running barefoot. But now he was stepping into it, not as a billionaire, but as a broken son looking for the last piece of a puzzle that haunted him nightly. Dressed in simple clothes and a cap pulled low, he navigated the narrow alleys with his driver at a distance, guided only by the photograph of Amaka and the address provided by the investigator. The smell of smoke and boiling beans filled the air. People shouted, generators hummed, and somewhere a woman cursed loudly at her stubborn child. This was not his world. Yet, for some reason, it felt more real than the glass offices and cocktail parties he was used to. He found the compound, a crumbling two-story building with peeling yellow paint and rusted gates. As he entered the corridor, he heard a familiar voice. It was rough, aged, yet unmistakably his father's. "He be like say rain go fall today," the old man said from a bench. And there he was, thinner, darker, older, but alive. Dominic Ease, once the lion of Lagos business, now sat barefoot on a bench, peeling oranges with Amaka beside him. She looked up first, startled by the stranger's presence. "Can I help you?" she asked, standing quickly, shielding the old man slightly. Obina's throat closed up. He had rehearsed this moment 100 times, but now words failed him. I'm just looking for someone," he stammered. Dominic looked up slowly, squinting. His eyes widened a little, but his voice stayed quiet. "Obina." It wasn't a question. It was recognition. Amaka looked between them, confused. Obina felt tears rise and forced himself to kneel beside the man. "Papa, it's me." The silence that followed was heavy. Amaka stepped back slightly, sensing something deeper than she understood was unfolding. Dominic touched his son's face, tracing the line of his jaw like a blind man rediscovering sight. "You look like your mother," he murmured. Obina nodded, eyes glistening. "I miss her." Dominic exhaled, a shaky, tired breath. "Me too, every day." They sat in silence for a few seconds, the noise of the compound fading behind the weight of that moment. Then Dominic turned to Amaka, who was still watching them with cautious eyes. "This is my son," he said. The man I lost before I lost myself. Obina looked at Amaka then, for the first time really seeing her. There was a softness in her face that reminded him of something he couldn't name. Maybe grace, maybe mercy. He stood slowly. Thank you for saving my father. Amaka, overwhelmed, simply nodded. She didn't yet understand the storm she had walked into, but she had already become its calm. Back in his car, Obina sat in silence, staring out at the children playing in the dirt road as if nothing monumental had just happened. His driver asked if he was okay, but he didn't answer. His heart was beating so fast it felt like a drum. Seeing his father like that, broken, humbled, had unraveled something in him. But more confusing was the girl, Amaka. She wasn't beautiful in the glamorous sense. Her hair was wrapped in an old scarf, her slippers worn out, and her dress simple. But her eyes, those eyes carried something raw, something powerful. For a man used to women who wore diamonds like skin, Amaka's plainness was jarring and refreshing. She had loved a stranger with nothing to gain, and in doing so she had done what wealth, servants, and reputation could not. She had brought his father back to life. Over the next few days, Obina found himself obsessing. He looked up her name, found nothing. No social media, no articles, not even a blog post. She was a ghost in a digital world. He sent his team to investigate discreetly. What they brought back stunned him. Her father had died years ago in a car crash while delivering clothes. She had dropped out of university to support her family. Her mother was ill. Her younger brother was frequently in and out of the hospital. She ran a one-woman tailoring business from home. Yet despite crushing poverty, neighbors described her as the kindest person in the street. One woman said Amaka once gave her her only wrapper during a flood. Another swore Amaka had paid her child's school fees with her last money. Every story painted the same picture, a girl who suffered silently, but gave endlessly. Obina, who had built his empire through numbers, deals, and hard negotiations, found himself confused. How could someone give so much without asking for anything? Why would anyone take in a dying old man, especially one who stank of urine and had no memory? His ex-girlfriends wouldn't have even looked at him. He remembered once dumping a woman because she brought her sick cousin on a vacation. Too much drama, he had said then. But Amaka had embraced drama, suffering, and responsibility without flinching. Who was this girl? He had dated beauty queens, influencers, and even senators' daughters. But none of them had made him feel small. Yet in front of Amaka, he felt like a child staring at something holy. He didn't know if it was admiration, guilt, or something deeper. But he knew this. He needed to know more. Not about what she did, but why she did it. And for the first time in years, Obina felt curious about something other than money. Dominic's health began to deteriorate just a few days after Obina's visit. The reunion, though emotional, had been too late for time to undo the damage years of street life had done to his body. Amaka noticed at first the tremor in his hands, the way his coughs got deeper, blood-stained, and how his appetite shrank. She begged him to go to the hospital, but he refused. "I want to die here," he said softly. "Not in a cold bed with machines, but among people who still see me." Obina came back the next morning with 2 doctors and a private ambulance. Amaka blocked the door. He said he doesn't want machines. He wants peace. Can't you give him that? Obina's eyes burned with conflict. His instinct was to fix everything with money, but money couldn't repair what years had broken. He looked at his father lying weak on the mattress, smiling faintly. "Obina," Dominic whispered, "come close." Obina sat beside him, ignoring the doctors behind him. "I was a bad father," Dominic said, "but I never stopped loving you. I just didn't know how." Obina's lips trembled. "You let her die," he said bitterly. "And then you left me." Dominic nodded. "I know, and I would undo it all if I could. But I can't." His hand reached for Amaka's and squeezed it gently. She gave me something you couldn't buy. She reminded me of your mother, not in face, but in how she gave without being asked. She made me remember I was once a man. Obina, whatever you do in life, take care of her. Not out of pity, but because she carries something rare. Something your mother died waiting for. A tear slipped from the old man's eye. Then he closed his eyes and whispered his last words. Tell Adora, I finally came home. Moments later, Dominic Ease, the Lion of Lagos, the man who once ruled empires, breathed his last in a poor girl's room, surrounded by nothing but the warmth of human kindness. The funeral was private. Obinna didn't want the media turning his father's final moment into a spectacle. But he ensured Amaka and her family were seated front row. Some of the company board members frowned, but he didn't care. Amaka, dressed in her only black gown, wept quietly beside her mother. She didn't cry for herself, but for the man who died like her own father, broken, tired, but grateful. After the burial, Obinna didn't go to the mansion. He didn't return to his penthouse. Instead, he followed Amaka back to Ajagunal. As they sat under the same bench where his father had once peeled oranges, he looked at her and asked, "Why did you do it?" Amaka looked away, then back at him. Because he looked like he had been forgotten. And no one deserves to die forgotten. Obinna felt something shift in him, a feeling unfamiliar and disarming. And for the first time since his mother's death, he felt like he was finally learning how to live. Amaka returned to her tailoring stand in the market 2 days after the burial, as though nothing had changed. But everything had. People whispered now when she walked past, some in admiration, others in envy. The girl who once sewed torn uniforms and patched wrappers was now the girl who buried a billionaire. No one knew the full story, only that a black SUV had escorted her home and that someone rich, someone important, had paid her family's rent and hospital debts without fanfare. Amaka tried to ignore the stares and continue her work. Her sewing machine was her refuge, the rhythm of the pedal grounding her spirit. Still, she couldn't shake the memory of the old man's fragile smile as he took his last breath. He had become family, and now she felt like she had lost something that didn't even belong to her. A strange ache that had no name. That was when Obinna began showing up, not in flashy cars or designer clothes, but in quiet steps, standing by the fruit stall across from her table, pretending to inspect yams or oranges. At first, Amaka watched him from the corner of her eye, confused, then annoyed. "Why is he here?" she asked her mother one night. Her mother, more perceptive than she let on, said, "Because not all debts are paid in cash." One afternoon, Obinna finally approached her stand. He didn't say much, just watched her thread the needle with a quiet intensity. "You came back," she said without looking up. "I had questions," he replied. "About what?" she asked. "About you. About how someone like you still exists in a place like this." Amaka sighed and met his eyes. "Pain doesn't cancel kindness, Obinna. It should teach it." That response silenced him more than any insult would have. Day after day, he returned, never asking for anything, never bringing gifts, just sitting, watching. Sometimes he helped carry her supplies, other times he chased off rude customers. Slowly, the market women grew fond of him, not for his money, but for his quiet respect. He didn't brag, he listened. And in listening, he began to see Amaka not as a project or a mystery, but as a mirror to everything he had never understood about real life. She wasn't impressed by his name. She wasn't interested in his businesses. She didn't care that he was Obinna Ease. What moved her was integrity, humility, patience. And Obinna, raised on wealth, trained to dominate, began learning how to kneel. For the first time in years, he was just a man trying to be worthy in the eyes of someone who had no reason to forgive him, yet still chose not to judge him. Obinna had always believed that money could solve anything: heartbreak, humiliation, loss, even love. It had become his shield, the thing he wielded when emotions became too messy. But with Amaka, it failed him completely. He had once bought a woman a car just to end an argument. He had flown another to Dubai simply to apologize. But Amaka couldn't be bought, couldn't be tamed, and most of all, couldn't be impressed. Every time he tried to offer something, a generator for her sewing business, school fees for her brother, clothes for her mother, she would politely decline or redirect him to someone more in need. "I'm not your charity case," she said once, not unkindly, just firmly. That hit him hard. No one had ever said no to his money before. Not like that. Not with such grace and conviction. It made him feel small, human. He found himself replaying conversations with her at night, trying to understand why she affected him so deeply. She wasn't like his exes, who faked interest in his business only to slip into his bed. Amaka was different. She asked real questions. She listened without flattery. She challenged him. When he once referred to one of his security staff as just a driver, she had cut in sharply. That man has a family. He's not just anything. That moment stuck with him for days. Her eyes, fierce yet kind, haunted him. She wasn't rude, but she never allowed him to speak carelessly. She held him accountable. And in doing so, she made him realize how many years he had spent floating above real life, disconnected from anything grounded in truth. She didn't need him to rescue her. She needed him to see her, truly. And that scared him more than he wanted to admit. Still, change doesn't come easily. One night, he went out drinking with old friends. They mocked his new lifestyle, calling him Pastor Obina, and teasing him for hanging around a market girl. One of them, a senator's son, laughed and said, "Let's see how long this poverty experiment lasts." Something in Obina snapped. He stood up mid-conversation and walked out of the bar. As he drove through the city streets, he felt disgusted, not with them, but with who he used to be. The version of himself that saw people as status, women as trophies, and emotions as weakness. He parked outside Amaka's compound and just sat in his car, watching her window, lit faintly from inside. He didn't call her. He just sat there for hours. For once in his life, Obina didn't want to control the story. He just wanted to be a part of something honest, even if it hurt, even if it didn't end the way he wanted. Because for the first time, he wasn't running from pain. He was trying to understand it. It happened on a Sunday afternoon. Amaka had just returned from church, a small Bible tucked under her arm, sweat clinging to her neckline from the walk back. She saw Obina waiting by her sewing table and sighed. "You don't rest," she teased. He smiled, nervous. Something about his posture was off. "Can we talk?" he asked. "Somewhere private?" She hesitated but nodded, leading him to the bench near the back of the compound. As they sat, he took a deep breath. "There's something I haven't told you," he began. Amaka folded her arms, sensing the shift. "The man you helped, the one who died here, he was my father." The silence between them broke, like glass. Her mouth parted slightly, brows tightening. "What?" she asked slowly. "Chief Dominic was your father?" Obina nodded, eyes glassy. "I should have told you. But I was afraid. You deserved better than the mess I was in." Amaka stood abruptly, heart pounding. The old man, the one she had washed, fed, fought for, was the same man whose son had once owned headlines, and whose arrogance had reshaped the nation's economy. She felt a rush of emotions, betrayal, disbelief, confusion. "Why didn't you tell me earlier?" she asked. "You let me pour myself into him, thinking he was just another human forgotten by the world. But he wasn't just anybody. He was yours." Obina reached for her hand. "I didn't lie. I didn't want you to treat him differently." The sincerity in his voice made her chest tighten, but the pain was louder. She looked at him, at the man who had slowly started to break through her walls, and slapped him across the face, hard. The sound echoed through the compound. Everyone turned, but she didn't care. Her eyes were full of tears. "You left your father to die in a gutter," she whispered. "And now you want to play savior?" Obina didn't react. He didn't raise his voice or defend himself. He just stood there, hand to his cheek, eyes heavy with shame. "I deserve that," he said. "But please don't walk away. Not yet." Amaka turned, shaking, unable to face him. Her heart warred with itself. He had been honest. Too late, yes, but honest still. She had never asked for his background. Maybe she had been afraid to. Maybe deep down, she knew he was hiding something. But this was too much. She walked into her room, shut the door, and collapsed against it. Her chest heaved not just from anger, but from the realization that she was falling for a man carrying more ghosts than she knew. And now, she wasn't sure if her heart could survive one more betrayal. The week that followed the slap was a storm of silence. Obina didn't return to the market, and Amaka didn't ask about him. But her soul felt restless. She worked harder than usual, sometimes stitching clothes till her fingers bled, just to avoid thinking. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the old man, Dominic, smiling weakly as she fed him water, as she tucked him into that threadbare mattress. She remembered his last night, his shaking hands, the way he held her palm and whispered, "Thank you, my daughter." The memory now ached like betrayal. How could someone she loved, like a father, belong to the very world that had always stepped on people like her? She thought about Obina's eyes that day, how they didn't plead, just accepted the hurt. That unnerved her more than anything. A proud man humbled. A man who didn't run. That was rare. Too rare. But pain didn't wait for reflection. Her landlord returned, this time with 2 police officers. "Time's up," he barked. "I let you stay after the burial, but I'm not a charity home." Her mother tried to beg, but her knees gave way, and she fell to the ground crying. Amaka's younger brother clung to her skirt, confused and scared. Amaka stood in the doorway, fists clenched, heartbreaking. She had nothing left to sell. No savings. The small income from her sewing couldn't cover half the debt. They began dragging out their belongings, the mattress, the gas stove, even her sewing machine. It felt like dying slowly. People gathered to watch, some in sympathy, others in quiet judgment. One woman clicked her tongue and said, "That's life. 1 minute you're feeding billionaires' fathers, next minute you're back on the street." Amaka couldn't even defend herself. Her throat was dry, her soul drained. But she stood her ground, refused to cry. At least not there. Just as they reached for the last bag of clothes, a black SUV pulled up. The door opened, and Obina stepped out, not in a suit, not in polished shoes, but in jeans and slippers, face raw with worry. "What's happening?" he demanded. The landlord folded his arms smugly. "Your girlfriend's family owes 6 months' rent. We're simply enforcing the law." Obina turned to Amaka, whose face was pale with disbelief. "You didn't tell me," he whispered. She didn't answer. She didn't want pity. But the shame burned. "How much?" he asked coldly. When the amount was stated, he pulled out his phone, transferred twice the amount, and added, "Also, paint this building. Fix the roof. And if anyone ever lays a hand on them again, they'll deal with me directly." The landlord's face crumbled. The police retreated. The crowd dispersed. Amaka stood frozen, her pride battling her reality. And in that quiet moment, her mother fell to her knees and wept, not for shame, but for relief. For the first time in years, help had come not as noise, but as dignity. Amaka didn't speak to Obina for 3 days after the eviction drama. He didn't push. He just checked on them through a distance, paid Ikena's hospital bill anonymously, left groceries by the door, sent quiet text messages that were mostly unanswered. Then one afternoon, he asked her to follow him. No explanations. Just, "Please. Just come." She was reluctant, but something about his quiet insistence pulled her along. They drove past the city center into a moderately busy street with a row of shops and boutiques. He parked in front of one, freshly painted, newly furnished. On the glass door was a sign, Amaka's Tailoring and Designs. She stared at it, unsure if it was a joke. "What is this?" she asked. Obina turned, nervous. "It's yours. The shop. Fully paid. 1 year rent down. Sewing machines. Fabric in stock. I know you said you don't want to depend on me. This isn't about dependence. It's about deserving. You carried my father when no one else would. Let me carry you now." The words struck deep. Her pride screamed, but her heart melted. She walked inside slowly, shelves lined with colorful fabric, a modern sewing machine humming silently in the corner, full-length mirrors, soft lighting. It looked like a dream stitched from her childhood. She touched the machine gently, her eyes misting. "You didn't have to do this," she whispered. Obina stepped behind her. "I know, but I wanted to. And more than that, you earned it." She turned around, hands trembling. "Don't do this because of guilt, Obina. Don't try to fix what's broken inside you with things. I'm not a healing project." He looked at her with something deeper than affection. "You're not a project. You're the only person who's shown me what it means to give without conditions. And that terrifies me. But it also saved me." Her tears fell silently, but for the first time, she didn't hide them. She let them come, because this time, they weren't from pain. They were from hope. She took the key, not because she needed him, but because she finally believed she could stand tall with it. The next morning, the shop opened with no fanfare, no ribbon cutting. Just Amaka, her mother, and Ikena seated quietly inside, her name shining above them like a whisper from destiny. Customers trickled in, some out of curiosity, others out of trust. They saw the girl who used to patch clothes under a leaking zinc now taking measurements in a boutique with dignity. Her first customer paid double the price. "For the courage you carry," the woman said. Amaka smiled, a smile that reached her eyes for the first time in years. Outside, Obina watched from his car, not wanting credit, not needing applause. He just wanted her to rise. Because somehow, in helping her rise, he was finally learning how to live without running from everything he had destroyed. And for the first time since his mother died, he felt worthy. Obina sat across from Amaka one evening in her shop after closing hours, the quiet between them no longer filled with tension, but a kind of sacred stillness. He watched her arrange fabrics, pin notes on clients' orders, and double-check her ledger. She moved with purpose, strength, and grace, like someone who had built her life one prayer at a time. And the more he watched her, the more he realized how far he'd come. "You don't know what you did to me," he said softly. She looked up surprised. "You talk like I performed surgery." He smiled faintly. "You did, just not with knives. You cut through my noise, my walls, my ego, and you made me feel like a human again." She sat beside him then, her face unreadable. "So what do you want now?" she asked gently. "Do you want me? Or do you just want to escape your guilt?" Obina swallowed. That question had lived in his head too. But tonight he knew his answer. "I want you," he said. "But not because I'm broken. Because I finally understand what it means to value someone. You didn't feed my father because you knew who he was. You fed him because that's who you are. And when I saw that, I saw my mother in you. I saw the woman I lost. I saw what love looks like, the kind that isn't earned or bought, just lived." His voice cracked. "I don't want to hurt you, Amaka. And I may still mess up. But I'll never walk away. Not from you." She studied him for a long time, eyes soft but guarded. "I'm not asking you to be perfect," she said. "I'm just asking you to be present. That's something your father never gave your mother. Don't make the same mistake with me." He reached out, took her hand gently. "I won't." And for the first time, Amaka didn't pull away. They sat like that for a while, not as billionaire and seamstress, not as wounded hearts trying to fix each other, but as two people daring to believe that maybe, just maybe, broken things could become beautiful again. Outside, Lagos roared with its usual chaos. But inside that little shop, something rare was blooming. Obina didn't need red carpets or headlines. He didn't need her to worship him or melt at his wealth. He just needed to know she could trust him. And Amaka, scarred as she was, finally allowed herself to lean into something that felt real. Neither of them said the words. Not yet. But love doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it simply shows up, mending what power once destroyed, healing where silence once reigned. And in that quiet, something eternal was born. Not a fairy tale, but a redemption. Obina stood on the balcony of his father's old study, staring at the sprawling city below. His heart was at peace, yet his mind was restless. Ever since Dominic's death, Obina had tried to fulfill the promise he made, to take care of Amaka, not out of guilt, but out of love and respect. Yet something had been tugging at him, a question he hadn't asked, a door he hadn't opened. That door turned out to be a literal one, a locked drawer in his father's old desk. He had avoided the room for weeks, but on this day, something guided him there. He pulled open the drawer with the spare key his father's lawyer had given him, and there it was. A second will, dated 6 months before Dominic disappeared. It was signed and stamped. Obina's name was still there, yes, but what startled him was the presence of another name, Amaka Uma. The will clearly stated, that if anything ever happened to Dominic, and if he were to die outside the family home, a portion of his personal estate, not business assets, but private properties, would go to the individual who restores to me the dignity of my humanity. That person, according to his final note, was a woman I may not yet have met, but will know by how she treats me when I am nothing. Obina's hands trembled as he read further. The deed to a small country house, a private bank account, and a letter addressed directly to Amaka were all sealed inside the file. His father had written about the pain of his own arrogance, the suffering he had caused Adora, and his desire to leave behind a legacy not of wealth, but of redemption. Obina stood frozen for a moment, then whispered. He knew, even before he met her, he was hoping someone like her existed. But the twist didn't end there. When Obina contacted the family lawyer to begin executing the will, he was told someone else had recently attempted to claim Dominic's rural property. A relative named Chinidu, Dominic's greedy cousin, who had been eyeing the estate for years. Chinidu had always believed Dominic would die without updating his documents. Now, upon hearing Amaka's name in the revised will, he filed a legal challenge, claiming she manipulated a sick man. Obina was livid. She didn't even know who he was, he barked. But Chinidu wasn't backing down. Obina, enraged but composed, turned to Amaka and told her everything. At first, she was speechless. I never wanted his money, she whispered. Obina nodded. I know. But now it's not about money. It's about honoring the truth. And so a new battle was brewing, not just for land, but for legacy. And the girl who once fed a stranger by a dustbin was now at the center of a storm. The court case took months, dragging Amaka through a new kind of suffering, public scrutiny. Headlines began swirling. Market girl named in Billionaire's will. Mysterious tailor inherits country house. Was she a gold digger or a guardian angel? The press spun stories with no facts, while Chinida's legal team painted Amaka as an opportunist who preyed on a vulnerable man. But through it all, she remained dignified. She wore her simplest clothes to court, never raised her voice, never played the victim. Obina sat by her side every day, holding her hand when things got rough. His presence didn't erase the attacks, but it gave her strength. He could have paid his way out, but this time, he chose to fight with integrity. When he was asked why he supported her so fiercely, he answered, "Because she gave my father something I couldn't, a peaceful goodbye." When the judgment was finally passed, the courtroom fell silent. The judge, moved by Amaka's testimony and the overwhelming witness accounts of her kindness, ruled in her favor. The second will was declared valid. The property and assets assigned to Amaka would remain hers. But more importantly, her name was cleared. Reporters waited outside the courthouse, cameras ready for a victory statement. But Amaka said nothing. She walked out quietly, holding her mother's hand, her brother trailing beside her. Obina followed, proud but humbled. That night, he took her to the country house she now legally owned. It wasn't massive, but it was beautiful, quiet, with flowers blooming along the fence. She stood at the front porch, the stars above her, and whispered, "I don't deserve this." Obina walked up behind her. "You don't. You deserve more." As they stood under the moonlight, ready to begin a future that neither of them had planned, a black car drove slowly past the gate, its tinted windows pausing for just a moment before continuing down the lonely road. Neither of them noticed. But inside that car was a woman, eyes sharp, lips curled in bitterness. She had once dated Obina. She had once been promised the mansion. And now she had seen the new queen take her place, not a socialite, not a beauty queen, but a nobody from the slum. She clenched the steering wheel. "Let her enjoy it for now," she muttered. "But this isn't over." And with that, the car disappeared into the night. Back at the house, Amaka placed her hand over Obina's heart and said, "Let's build something that can't be destroyed." He kissed her forehead. "As long as it's with you, I'll rebuild everything." They didn't know it yet, but the peace they had found was just the calm before the next storm. To be continued. Thank you for watching this video. What did you learn from this story? Drop it in the comments. Please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel TOCHI Stories for more.